For my presentation, I'm going to be doing a tier list. Anyways, I picked 7 chapters, as per stated, that I'm going to be ranking from S to F, but this does not have to do with how the class was taught. It's just the information that is inside these chapters. And so, we're gonna start off here. At the beginning, I picked chapter 1. It's all about the psychologies, different types of psychologies, and the psychologists in those fields. I'm gonna talk about some of the parts. I like the critique a lot. Abraham Maslow and his big pyramid and humanistic theory in general is not my slice of pizza or slice of life that I get into. I think humanists are kind of delusional in a way that everyone needs to have this like high up goal of self peakness. But this category is saved because of guys like Carl Jung, which is a psychodynamic type of psychology, which is really interesting how it separates an average person into 3 parts. You have the persona, the mask, and the subconscious part of each person. And how a mask is, what you show everybody, and I think it's not really talked about too much that people can have several masks. Like, you talk to your family, you'll have your own mask for your family. Talk to your friends, it'll look a little different. And meeting someone for the first time, it just continues. And they also talk about how almost everything about you, mainly the ugly parts, is all subconscious. And we'll talk about this later, but if there is trauma in a person, it's usually subconscious. But overall, this is a great chapter because it shows you different avenues not everyone wants to do. Psychodynamics, there's cognitive, there's behaviorism, humanistic. I don't know why you would want that. I mean, it's nice. It's a good idea to be like all sweet and lovey-dovey. Biological thinking is pretty disconnected from emotion. It's more black and white. I'm not really a fan of black and whiteness in the idea of psychology. But with everything in mind, theoretical frameworks or psychology chapter 1 is an S tier choice. Solid. And then we get to it's very controversial to talk about this subject here. So I'm gonna be very careful to not get expelled. So, sex and gender, which it's not sex or gender. Sex being what you were or how you were born, genitalia, biological wise, and gender, which is it's a social construct about being straight, gay, and bisexual. A lot of people think is the limit. Years progressed, we got into different titles and identities for people like transsexuals, but I do think the information covered in this section was pretty good. So I'm gonna rank this a solid B. Chapter 6 learning is actually it's going to be underrated, and I don't know if it's going to be picked a lot, but people like B.F. Skinner, he thinks that free will is an illusion, and that a lot of our ways of learning is like black and white, where we can observe things without thinking like what's going on in our mind, and then we kind of just reproduce it if we don't get punished. So And vice versa, if we're doing something terrible and we don't think about it, but then we get punished, we will then associate that with something that is, bad. So Pavlov, I think Pavlov was just as susceptible to his learnings as his dog. We talked about how his dog was influenced by time. He would associated food with the sound of a bell. I'd like to think that every time Pavlov heard a bell, he started thinking, oh man, I should go feed my dog. So it's classical conditioning. It's very interesting, especially if you want to, become your own subject and teach yourself something new. There's plenty of ways in there on how to develop these new skills. And oh, before I go further, I do want to mention that Vygotsky's, he's also one of my favorite ones in the theoretical frameworks section. But I think it's a shame that he died so early. He died in his 30s, which is like, wow, unfair. This is about social impact on learning, and children can be mentored and get developed further in certain aspects of their learning experiences. Because Piaget thought, we have a set schedule on learning, and we can't learn outside of these boundaries. But Vygotsky, he saw in a different manner that children that are exposed to mentorship in his elementary mental functions, his model, and social relations help improve on aspects that before you would think, oh, a kid can't learn like algebra. With a mentor he can, and with the correct type of surrounding social structure that he's living in, he can influence higher levels of education at earlier stages. I feel like this would even apply to language as a whole. So I think this is actually, I feel like this might be a contender for first spot S tier. We go into memory. Memory is more of a scary subject than anything, especially if you have Alzheimer's down the road. Like, memory was an alright chapter. There's short-term and long-term memory. So the processing theories with the general memory process, the 3 stages being encoding, having the memory written in your brain, storage, it being retained, and then retrieval, it being used when you need it. So you're taught how to ride a bike, it's encoded, it gets stored. I do know that senses affect memory. That was a different chapter, which didn't make the cut. Talked about how memory can be affected by senses, right? Like smells. In class, we talked about how smells are one of the best methods of, retrieval, getting those memories back. So if something from your past, when you were a child, and you smell an aroma all the time, like mom's cooking, or maybe like how the water would smell, and you get into a situation years later, bam, it's almost instant how well it connects the memory to your senses. But with everything around it, I'm gonna have to put this in C tier. As far as disorders go, it's a extremely interesting chapter. Anyways, I think this chapter was one of the better ones. Especially the course material was very entertaining. Like the books we were given on how to somewhat diagnose someone, but did help a lot. And stuff like anxiety was really well explained, and panic attacks being this feeling of the fight or flight, in the best way to put it, but consistently without an actual outside force being responsible for it. But I can't put it in S tier, because the more disorders you go, you might see like, damn, and begin to self-diagnose yourself. So because of those reasons, I have to leave it an A. I can't put an S, but I do want to talk about it a little more. It talked about people who are bipolar. People in my family have been bipolar, and seeing the information given was pretty crazy because I didn't know there's two different types of being bipolar. One with mood swings and then consistent, and another one where it's not so consistent at all. It's more chronic. It'll be like a season of being bipolar, which I didn't know. So it deserves its A tier, no matter what. Chapter 11, Social Psychology. There are some things in here which I feel like I already knew, especially dealing with love languages, which I learned because of being a young man, you know. But I do think that it's important for people to know that there is, love languages in the first place, and put it in a tier list just like this, from most important to least. I wouldn't say important, but least affecting. And there's another side to that where there's the love languages people like to receive, and then there's love languages people like to give, which they can be similar, they could be interconnected, but it could also be different. This also helps you think about, especially at work, someone who is a very big fan of like the love language, sense of touch, physicalness, might be one of those like managers or bosses that always pats your back or whatever. But then you have an employee that absolutely hates being touched. So they will end up seeing each other as like not big friends, to say that. And there is one key aspect here, out of all the information in this chapter, is speaking about cognitive dissonance. Well, to put it frankly, it's when your actions, they don't feel right. If you write it down, it might not sound so bad. Someone who is cheating is in those moments, they feel happy or relieved, maybe in a sexual manner. But there is, back to the term cognitive dissonance, there's that break where they themselves do not feel right with their body. It's consistency within their beliefs, their attitudes, and their behavior. But social psychology as a whole chapter in itself is, I feel like it's lacking. It's a lacking chapter. I did enjoy the in-person class little assignment with the pheromones. That was pretty cool. And last but not least, we have therapy. That should be the most fresh in everyone's mind. The chapter about, well, if you were in class, you would have seen the videos on how this woman was given 3 different methods of therapy. She went to the same place, 3 different psychologists, not psychiatrists. Psychiatrists are ones that are able to medicate you, but they're not so infatuated with the idea of getting to know you. So this woman was given 3 different psychology methods. One, it's more of a quiet approach. It's a very humanistic approach of listening, getting deep, but not giving answers. It's a key important note to it. So you're not giving them answers. And she just put everything on the table there. Whereas something like a Gestalt method of therapy, he was, when we reference chapter 1's Mask, he was breaking down this social barrier and bringing out a more true version of herself into this therapy room, and getting her to stop like beating around the bush or being so nice. And the whole view of Gestalt is to have someone become their own self-reliant method of therapy. There's also group therapy. People, if someone's like in a bad habit, smoking clubs. But group therapy can also be for pretty darker stories, like cancer, like getting over it clubs, or someone has PTSD. On the medical side, there are some weird methods. I don't agree with drugs, but I know people use them, especially if you are low on dopamine or serotonin. There's two that I wasn't thinking about. Psychosurgery, you might relate to lobotomies, but it's a little different than that. It's mainly for tumors, and which I thought was crazy, for OCD. I'm not sure how that's gonna affect you too well, but if it works, it works. And the last one was brain stimulation, which we also saw in video on how people with Parkinson's or Tourette's or tremors can actually be relieved of those shakes using electricity. It's a good subject. I think therapy is a solid A, and the numbers speak for themselves. It was what 43% people of adults, pardon, 43% of adults have gone to therapy of some sort, and I don't think there was any bad chapter, like nothing that was F tier. I think all chapters, especially the ones I chose, have their place. Other people might have a different view of these chapters and put them in different spots or just choose different ones, but this is what I think, and I enjoyed the class.